I have been saying for some time that I think that the greatest crime against democracy is not the privatization of our prisons, although that's pretty bad. It's not the privatization of 70% of our intelligence. That's pretty bad. It's not the privatization of so much of our military, perhaps certainly well over 50% of our military functions. That's pretty bad. It's the privatization of what Thomas Paine referred to as the beating heart of democracy, our vote. And of all the journalists in all the world who have been on this case, more than any other who would walk into this bar, Brad Friedman, publisher of the Brad blog, bradblog.com, Twitter, the Brad blog, and at Brad Friedman. Brad, welcome back to the program.
Hey, Tom, great to be here. By the way, I'm not at Brad Friedman, so we don't want to punish whoever that might be on the Twitters by sending them hate tweets as I usually get.
Okay, so it's at the Brad blog.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, great. Tell us what is the current state of the information that we have about the difference between the exit polls that we're doing and the actual results that are being recorded on our electronic voting machines. We know that these numbers, before electronic voting machines, the exit polls were quite accurate in predicting the outcome of elections, that with the advent of electronic... Actually, why don't you go through that rather than me?
Well, concern really began to focus on the exit polls versus the election results back in 2004 when you had all of these states, these swing states that were supposed to go for John Kerry, ended up going to George W. Bush. And of course, at the time, they said it was the exit polls that were wrong. It wasn't the actual results. They had no real evidence for that. In fact, they had bad evidence that they tried to present. And then what you've seen over the years is fewer and fewer exit polls and less access to the data in those exit polls. They're really keeping them secret from the public. They use them when they want to use them for the purposes they want to use them, but they don't let us see it. But, you know, when you talked in your introduction there about the privatization of the voting system itself, that's really at the heart here. And I would go so far as to say not just the privatization, but with it, the secretization, if you will, of our voting system and the inability for voters to actually oversee the results. And that's exactly what we're coming crashing up against, I'm afraid, in Virginia today, the day after yesterday's election there, particularly now in this Virginia's Attorney General's race.
So what is the spread? What is the difference between what the exit polls said happened in Virginia and what the electronic voting machines said happened in Virginia?
Actually, we don't know. We don't know yet, and we probably won't know the difference between the exit polls and the actual election results because they don't release that raw data. It's very selective data that they now release. You've heard, young voters, turned out in a higher percent than they did 4 years ago, that sort of
Before
thing.
the 2004 elections, though, they routinely released that raw data, didn't they?
Yeah, you would be able to get that raw data. I mean, it was that raw data that leaked out on election night on 2004 that everybody pointed to and said, look, this is how we know that John Kerry likely won these states. Now, but exit polls are not perfect. Don't get me wrong. They are better than the pre-election polls, but because, they're asking people when they walk out of the polls, how did you vote? But, but they're not perfect. But when you see in state after state after state, all of them, quote unquote, failing in one direction, it's certainly going to raise eyebrows. But it also underscores, Tom, the need to oversee our own results so that we don't have to guess were the results right, were the exit polls right. And, I mentioned Virginia. We're looking at an attorney general's race there. This was the only one that the Republicans may pull out. We'll see. 2.2 million votes cast. About 300 votes, last I checked, separated the Republican and the Democrat. It's almost certain to have a recount, or I should say a quote-unquote recount, because most of the state of Virginia cast their ballot on 100% unverifiable touchscreen voting systems. there's nothing to recount, Tom. It's been privatized. You can't look at the machines, but even if you could, there's no way to know that any single vote cast on one of those machines actually reflects the intent of the voter. So, I mean, it's going to be really a pretend recount. In the state of Virginia, the voters will never know who really won and who really lost that race. And Virginia's not alone. We have that same problem all over the country.
Now, Brad, I'm guessing you've probably had an experience similar to this. I have sat down with fairly heavy hitters in the Democratic Party, shall we say, and said, you guys should do something about this. I mean, this, I'm not trying to be paranoid here, but just in principle, just the principle that the vote has been privatized is wrong. We should make the vote once again part of the commons. I mean, my mom was one of those election people where she, went down and she checked your name into the book, and they would stay up until the wee hours of the night counting ballots. I mean, they would that's what they did, and it was just, it was the people in the neighborhood did it. They volunteered. People volunteered, and they were overseen by, she had a Republican over one shoulder, a Democrat over the other, as she was counting ballots. We no longer do that. We no longer have this visibility. And the response that I get from the Democratic Party officials and from elected Democrats is, we don't want to talk about that because if people don't trust the vote, they won't show up to vote. Now, Republicans have made an article of faith about not trusting the vote. If a Republican lost, it's because there were 10,000 Latinos, illegal aliens who were bussed in and illegally voted, and Acorn did it all, right? I mean, the Republicans have made this an article of faith and have gotten laws passed in double-digit states to suppress the vote as a consequence of it. They've actually turned, doubting the vote into their favor.
Yeah.
Why, is there anybody who's talking about this? There was, a point in time, I mean, Bernie Sanders, people call the show and Bernie's on Friday, and he will always say, we need to scrap the machines and go back to paper. But I don't know anybody else who's really doing this as an issue. Do you?
As far as elected officials,
yeah.
No. They are concerned, or they say they're concerned about things like lines, things like voter suppression, and, rightfully so. They should be concerned about it. And it's interesting, by the way, that Republicans actually turned the idea of lack of confidence in voting into reasons to institute these laws. They created this lack of confidence by pretending that people were illegally voting at the polls, and then the Supreme Court said, well, you know what? People are afraid illegal people are voting at the polls, so it's okay to institute these laws even without evidence that they are doing so. So the Republicans used this lack of trust that they made up out of whole cloth to get the laws they needed passed, while the Democrats, you're right, it's really perverse. When they say we don't want to talk about this because people won't trust the vote and then they won't show up to vote, I mean, I have seen over the years as the politicians continue to not talk about this stuff, I have seen less and less confidence in the results in election after election. Right. You constantly hear people screaming for a recount, charging that there was problems with the electronic voting systems. If you want to instill confidence in the results of elections, I would argue, let the people oversee their own results. I think that's right. The only way to
Well, the other thing I'd like to know is, there was a 50,000 voter purge in Virginia just a week or two ago. And an exit poll would show how many of those people who were purged were given placebo ballots. And to the best of my knowledge, that question isn't showing up on so there's so much data that we could be getting with good exit polling. Anyhow, Brad Friedman, for our listeners on KPFK in Los Angeles, be sure to stay tuned because after our show's over, Brad's going to be back on KPFK discussing this issue. Brad, thanks so much for being with us.
Great talking to you, Tom.
Great talking with you, Brad.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
It's Twitter @TheBradBlog, and of course the website is bradblog.com. Brad Friedman. We'll be right back.